Penguin Random House Audio presents The Mirror of My Heart, 1,000 Years of Persian Poetry by Women. Translated with an introduction and notes by Dick Davis. Read for you by Dick Davis, Mozhan Marnò, Tala, Ashe, and Serena, Manteghi. Note to listeners, this program includes a downloadable PDF that contains notes from the book.
For Afgham, of course. The liberating space that was Persian poetry allowed subversive, indeed heretical, expressions, forbidden in any other media. Skepticism, even about the most sacred beliefs and duties, and sneering at the authorities, religious and political, was tolerated as the fruit of poetic imagination. Abbas Amanat. Woman's crime in our country is to be a woman. Alamtaj Jaleh, Iranian poet, 1883 to 1947. Introduction. A significant feature of Persian poetry that distinguishes it from most verse written in a European language is that almost all of it, from the earliest poems written over 1,000 years ago to the present day, remains relatively accessible to a contemporary speaker of the language. The 17th century English poet Edmund Waller bemoaned the fact that already his contemporaries could no longer easily read the works of the 14th century poet Chaucer. But who can hope his lines should long last in a daily changing tongue? We write in sand, our language grows, and like the tide our work o'erflows. Chaucer his sense can only boast, the glory of his numbers lost. And as if to confirm Waller's complaint, it was in Waller's lifetime that passages from Chaucer were first translated into contemporary English by Dryden. The Persian language, especially its literary form, has remained far more stable over the past millennium than is true of most European languages. There have been some changes of vocabulary and grammar, but by Western standards they are minor. A modern-day Iranian can read the works of the 10th century poet Ferdowsi with about the same ease as a modern-day English speaker can read those of 17th century authors, such as Waller and Dryden. There are some difficulties for a non-specialist in the period, but they do not obscure what is usually the obvious sense and rhetorical force of any given passage. A side effect of the fact that poems from centuries ago can seem and sound relatively contemporary to the Persian reader is that such poems could be, and were, taken as models by poets from a much later date. And this in turn has led to a quite extraordinary continuity of poetic rhetoric from the earliest poems until at least the mid-19th century, and even beyond that period. There is perhaps something else at work in this rhetorical continuity. All poetry is artificial in its language, but poetry in English has frequently tended to aim at language really used by men, as Wordsworth put it. And when this is the case, it tries as far as possible to disguise its artifice. By contrast, pre-modern Persian poetry tends to display and delight in its artifice. To say a poem in English sounds artificial is to condemn it. The same remark about a pre-modern Persian poem could well elicit the response, "Of course it does. It's a poem, isn't it?" And so the fact that a particular metaphor or rhetorical trope has been used by many other poets and is thought of as intrinsically poetic, rather than as colloquial, is not so much a barrier to its continued use as a validation of it. The poets Ayugi, 10th, 11th centuries, and Nezami, 12th century, both say that the poet is like the woman who tends to a bride's physical appearance before her wedding. That is, the poet uses his or her skill and artifice to make the subject as dazzlingly beautiful as possible. Other common metaphors used by poets themselves to describe poetry are that it is something woven, such as brocade, or a piece of jewelry, such as a pearl necklace. All three of these metaphors emphasize the aesthetic, artificial, fabricated, and artisanal nature of the craft, rather than say its sincerity or its truth-telling qualities, as they are foregrounded in much Western poetry, to hold the mirror up to nature, as Shakespeare's Hamlet says. To indicate something of the density and complexity of this artifice in pre-modern Persian poetry, here is a translation of a very early poem that is made up almost entirely of motifs that belonged to a common stock, widely utilized by other poets for centuries to come. The poem is by the 10th century poet Rabe'eh, who, as is appropriate for this volume, is the earliest known woman poet to write in Persian. The garden shows so many flowers, as though Mani had painted their resplendent glow. Dawn's breezes never bore Tibetan musk. How is the world so musky when they blow? Are Majnun's eyes within the clouds, that they shed Layli's cheek's hue on each rose below? Like wine within an agate glass, his tears have filled each tulip with their crimson glow. Raise up the wine bowl, raise it generously, since bad luck dogs deniers who say no. Narcissi glow with silver and with gold, its Castra's crown their shining petals show. Like nuns in purple cowls, the violets bloom. Do they turn into Christians as they grow? The poem is a Bahariyeh, that is, a poem welcoming the spring, a form that is still 1,000 years later a recognized category of Persian poetry, and it is set in the archetypal beautiful place for Persian culture, the locus aminus to end them all, a garden. But what is Mani, the 3rd century founder of the religion of Manichaeism, doing in the poem? In Persian law, he was also a painter, whose beautiful paintings look so true to life that they deceived both people and animals, and this accounts for painted in the 2nd line. Because the flowers are compared to Mani's paintings, this means they must be very beautiful, and Persian poetry takes it for granted that beauty is a major concern of every civilized person. And something else is going on here. Mani was the founder of a pre-Islamic religion seen as a heresy by Muslims, and yet he is mentioned, apparently favorably, in a poem written by someone we presume to be a Muslim. Persian poetry often mentions religions other than Islam, and in short lyric poems, like this one, the reference is almost always either favorable or neutral. It virtually never implies condemnation. This is less true of long didactic poems, in which religions other than Islam are sometimes implicitly or explicitly condemned. This suggests that Persian lyric poetry perhaps sees itself as somewhat at odds with an exclusively Islamic worldview, or at least as not prepared to denigrate other religions in its favor. And this is indeed the case. Persian lyric poetry is in general welcomingly receptive to both the pre-Islamic past and non-Islamic faiths. The implication is that there is not one sole truth applicable at all times to all people, that other ways of being, from the past or as an adherent of another faith, can be considered equally valid. Later on, such references were read as allegorical. The mention of a figure from another religion, for example, was seen as a metaphor for one who transmits mystical knowledge, that is, a knowledge outside of the mainstream of Orthodox Islam. And in later poems they often are allegorical, but they were meant quite literally for themselves in Rabe'eh's poems, as they were in the poems of her contemporaries and of many subsequent poets. Regarded as particularly refreshing and pleasant, the cool breeze of dawn, referred to in the 2nd stanza of the poem, is a constituent of the idealized landscapes of much Persian poetry. This breeze apparently brings the scent of musk, the most valued and expensive of medieval perfumes. And again, we see that we are being presented with an idealized situation in which everything, including the scented air, is as beguilingly charming and special as possible. The musk comes from Tibet, a remote and exotic place for the speaker, and the poem momentarily opens on a distant, almost fabulous reality, as with the mention of Mani. Here the musk is a metaphor for the scent of the garden's flowers as it is diffused by the breeze. The logic being that musk is the most precious perfume, so the flowers in this idealized garden share its scent, and this rare idealized loveliness provokes wonder in the speaker. Wonder at what seems perfect.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?